Hey everyone, I'm Clue. Welcome back to my command block tutorial series. So today we're going to go through the boss bar system and editing the data of some entities. But before that, there's some housekeeping to get in order. I've built a little axis indicator, so X positive, X negative, Z negative, and Z positive. That will come into play later when we start building some more complex contraptions, because command blocks do operate in a set axis order. Other than that, we've also got the sun to deal with, so nighttime is no good, so we'll go ahead and fix that and make it perpetual sunset, nice and pretty. The way this setup works is nice and simple. We're just using the set block command to fill in a redstone block and obviously the indicator block, and then this activates a time set command block just to constantly set the time back to 12,500, which is roughly the start of sunset. Other than that, we can see that the chat is now an issue, so we'll go ahead and we'll change the game rule, so command block output to false, and that way we can now not have to worry about all the spam of the time set filling up the chat. Anyway, on to the project. As for the command chains, we've got 3 for each different entity we're playing with today. So I want to set up 2 entities, an Iron Golem and a Vindicator, just as some practice dummies for us to use later on with some other creations. So we need to set up their boss bars, and of course we need to modify their data. The commands themselves for editing their data are fairly simple. We only need a 2 command block sequence. So in the first repeating command block, we're using data merge entity. So we're selecting an entity and we're going to fill in a couple things. First off, we're going to set a name. This allows us to tie it into a name tag. So now we can use a name tag to name an entity that will now undergo the effects of this command block. So we'll call it training dummy. And then we also need to set a tag. This comes into play on the second command block and essentially just blacklists the entity once its data has been modified. So we're just going to call it dummy. So once it's been labeled as a dummy, it won't have its data re-edited. And this is important because the data merge command can only target one entity at a time. So we also need to limit it to 1. If we change this, it no longer functions, even if it has the correct syntax. So we need limit 1, which also means we need to use sort random. Without sort random, the sorting defaults to nearest, meaning that the entity nearest to the command block is the one that's always going to be targeted. And this can cause a lot of problems, so we want it at random. Now we can start actually editing the data of the entity. So first up, for health, we're going to set to 1,000. Nice and high, perfect for a training dummy. Next, we have this no AI clause. So we're using 1b, which equals true. So this means that the Iron Golem has no AI. It won't attack back and it won't move, making it the perfect just standing training dummy. We've also got persistence required, so we've set that to true as well, and silent. So it won't make any noise, it won't move, and it will never despawn. Other than that, because we are changing the health, we also need this attribute clause. So attributes, and then the 2 brackets, square and curly. And because we're setting the health higher, we need to set the max health as well. These 2 attributes correspond to each other. So even if you were to set its normal health, so this is the health it has currently, to a high amount, it will level down to whatever the attribute is set to. Similarly, if the attribute is set high, but the base health or the current health is set to a lower amount, it won't actually have full health when it spawns. So we need to use generic.max health, and of course we need to set it to the equivalent, so 1000 HP. This means that it will spawn with a max total of 1000 HP and with 1000 HP currently. Nice and simple for our training dummy. So then next up, all we have to do is tag the entity. So we're tagging any entity that doesn't have a dummy tag that is named training dummy, we're going to give it the dummy tag. This stops the command block just repeating itself. Essentially, if this last segment, this chain command block wasn't set up, the entity would constantly be set to 1000 HP, and we don't want that. We want it to visibly take damage and allow us to test our abilities and just play around with it. We don't want it to constantly reset its HP. The other entity we've set up is exactly the same, so data merge entity, tag, blacklisting dummy. This time we're calling it attack dummy. And we don't actually need to set its type, but you can if you want to specify certain entities. So I'm going to delete this, but if you want to just target a specific type of entities without a name, without a tag, you can have it so say creepers are all set to a high movement speed, or have knockback resistance. Whatever you want to do, you can play around with it by using the type selector. I'm going to get rid of it because we're using our name as the selection parameter. Limit at 1, sort random again. This time we're only setting the health to 100, so a lot less, but still a sizable amount. The player can't just hit it a couple times and it's destroyed. persistence required, but we've gotten rid of that no AI clause because this is the attack dummy. So we want it to attack the player, and this will allow us to test things like shields or damage resistance, anything we sort of want to show off in the future. We've got one that can receive damage from the player and one that can do damage to the player. Silent, it's really up to you. It's just a personal choice. I'm just setting it to silent because they're just serving as dummies, so they don't need to make sound, and it's just going to get annoying in the background. Other than that, we're using generic.max HP again, so match to 100. This time we're adding in generic.movement speed. So you can add in any and all of the attributes you want, and the data merge command is far better than actually editing the NBT data normally. And the reason for this is this will modify their current movement speed to whatever the amount you set here. If you were to use the NPD data route, you would have to come up with a UUID. Similarly, if you were to use the attribute command, you would also have to come up with a UUID, a universally unique identification digit. I think that's what the D stands for. I'm not too sure. It's just a simpler route to just type in whatever attribute. So name, all you're replacing is, say, movement speed. You could do, I think it's attack damage, knockback resistance, armor toughness. You can just change it to whatever you want and then set the amount manually. So our two are set up. The second command is exactly the same. We're just tagging it with dummy. In fact, it's a little bit wrong because this should be attack, since that is the name we're using. Again, you don't need to set the type. You can if you want a certain selection. So now we can go ahead and name the two entities. So we've got training dummy, and of course we want attack dummy as the other one. Make sure to switch on your command blocks. I always forget this part. And we go ahead and summon them in, label them, and no sound, no attack, no movement. What about the Vindicator? Oh, you know what I'm on? I'm on peaceful. Change it to easy. Vindicator, name, attack dummy, can't move. No matter how much you want to try to get to the Iron Golem. Of course, if we spawn him near, he can actually still attack, which is really useful. We'll go ahead and move him. So if we take a quick look at his data using data get entity, we can select his UUID because our crosshair's on him. We can see that he does not have generic knockback. This means that we can't use our data merge command since he does not have the pre-existing attribute. This means we now need to use a different method to give him the attribute we desire. So if we come back over here, we're going to change this just a little bit. So instead of using the data merge command, we're now going to use the attribute command. So we're going to use all entities like normal and type in our selection criteria. So limit 1, because again, anything that modifies NBT data has to be limited to a single entity. It can't run on every entity loaded in the world. That would just cause major problems with the game. So limit 1, sort equals random, but we're going to add in our name criteria. So name equals attack dummy, who does not have that tag. So tag equals exclamation mark to blacklist it, dummy. So we want to edit knockback resistance. So if we scroll down, we can see all the different attributes we can select from. Knockback resistance, and we're going to use base, and this time set to 1. So this means that his knockback resistance will now be modified to 1. We go ahead and click done, change it on to conditional. So now if we go ahead and summon a new Vindicator, label it, you can see he stopped moving, but we also can't move him anymore, which is perfect because he's now a stationary training dummy. So we can position him a bit better, make it nice and symmetrical. But what about the boss bars? Because right now we have our dummies, but we can't actually see what we're doing to them. So we need to set up our next sequence of commands. So these first 4 commands are super simple. We're just using the basic boss bar command and then going through its list of things that we can sort of play around with. So boss bar add, its ID has to all be in lowercase so we can call upon it. So T dummy for training dummy, and then this is the actual name that will show up underneath the boss bar. So training dummy. Second one, we're just moving on to set. So we have to set the max amount of the boss bar. So this is the total value that is filled in. So because our Iron Golem has a total of 1,000, we're just setting it to 1,000. Then we're using set to set the style. I like the notch 10 because this means that every time one notch is empty, this means he's lost 10% of his HP or 100. It's nice and easy to work out our damage. Then last up, I'm just using the set color to set it to green because these entities are not hostile, so it's just a easy indicator to the player that there's nothing to worry about. Obviously, if you were making a boss, you might want to use something like red. The next four are a little bit more complex. These are the commands that will actually show the boss bar to the player. So we're just using execute at all players, and then if there's an entity nearby with one of our names, so training dummy, and then the second one will be attack dummy, within a set distance. So this means that the player has to be within 10 blocks of the training dummy for the boss bar to actually appear. After that, all we have to do is use boss bar set, but use the ID, so T dummy, players, and then all within that radius of 10. So this means that every player within 10 blocks to the boss will be given the boss bar data. After that, we have to, of course, make it visible. So simple, the premise is exactly the same. Execute at the player, set our distance parameter, and then this time we're setting visible to true. So boss bar set, and this is how you play around with all the different values. After that, we now need a cleanup mechanism to actually get rid of the boss bar when the player's away from it. So instead of if, we're using unless. So if the player is away from the entity this time, so outside that 10 block range, it's going to set the boss bar back to not visible, so false. And then of course, we actually have to have a command that generates the HP damage. So execute at all, again, if they're in that set distance. This time we're using run execute store result. So this allows us to collect data from something and store it to be used in another command. So execute store result boss bar T dummy value run data get entity training dummy. I know it sounds really complex, but it's nice and simple to break down. So all we're doing is storing the data from the entity. So we're storing the result for our boss bar T dummy, and the data we're storing is from the data get entity training dummy sort nearest. So this will always target the nearest entity to the player that's running the command, and it's going to set the health value. There's a lot of different ways you can play around with this. You could use this to set the max health and make a dynamic boss bar, but that is a lot more complicated, and we'll get into why in one of the later episodes. Other than that, they're nice and simple, so we go ahead and flip them all on. You can now see that we have the boss bar, but it's not filled in. So if we go ahead and activate this one, they've got their HP now, which of course we've hit them a couple times, so it has declined. It's not exactly 1,000. And we can go ahead and do the same for our other dummies. So now the command sequence is exactly the same, except I'm using A instead of T to signify attack dummy. So add the boss bar, then we're setting the boss bar to the max, this time 100 instead of 1,000. Then we're setting the style, again, I like notch 10. There's a lot of different ones you can pick between, just the normal full boss bar or different notches. And then the color, green as well, since it's a good representation of the non-hostile nature. Then we're doing exactly the same, but again, changing T to A to signify our attack dummy. So we can go ahead and turn these all on, which I have not been doing. Now, if we go close to an attack dummy, we can see we've got the HP, and it's whichever one we're closest to. So you can see it's swapping as we go between different attack dummies because I have done damage to them. We punch this one. Of course, we don't need them all, because these two... No, two of you... Oh, two of you are staying, that's nice. But you're no good. But anyway, that's how we've made some boss bars, and obviously modified their data to set up for some of our later commands where we can actually use them as guinea pigs to test out our creations. Hope you enjoyed!